All right, deep divers, welcome back to the show.
Always great to be back.
Today we're diving into something pretty unexpected, I guess you could say, a U.S. Army book, Building Healthy Connections, a relationship literacy guide for the United States Army. And before you tune out thinking, well, I'm not in the Army, so
Yeah.
trust me on this one, folks. There's some really good stuff in here for everyone, civilians included.
Absolutely. I mean, what's fascinating is this program didn't even start in the military.
Oh, really?
It was first used in like juvenile justice programs, then it moved into schools, then treatment centers, and it saw some incredible results.
Like what kind of results are we talking?
Oh, significant reductions in things like violence and recidivism rates, really impressive stuff.
Wow.
And now the Army's taking notice. They're facing their own, set of relationship challenges.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And this program is becoming a key part of how they're tackling those issues.
That's pretty wild to think about. So we're not just talking about, like saluting the right way here.
No.
What kind of challenges are we talking about exactly?
Well, I mean, the U.S. Army, they put a lot of emphasis on honor and integrity, right?
No, definitely.
But they've been dealing with some serious issues like sexual harassment and abuse within their ranks,
Makes sense.
which obviously goes against everything they stand for.
For sure.
So it's a big problem.
Okay, so that makes sense. But why focus on relationships as like the solution to that?
Well, the book makes a really interesting argument. It says that strong and healthy relationships are actually the foundation for a strong military. They see it as essential to everything, from morale to performance and even national security.
Wait, hold on a sec.
Yeah.
They're saying that like my personal relationships directly impact how well the entire Army functions.
Exactly. It's all connected. Think about it when you have incidents of sexual harassment, abuse, even just, plain old violence.
Yeah.
It really erodes the unit cohesion, it breaks down trust, and ultimately it makes it harder for the Army to carry out its missions. It's not just about individual behavior, it's about the interconnectedness of all the relationships within the system.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get the bigger picture here.
Yeah.
So how does this program actually address these challenges? What's their approach?
Well, they have this thing called the Relationship Literacy Program.
Okay.
And it's built around 4 main pillars, almost like the cornerstones of building these healthy connections.
Interesting. So break it down for me. What are these pillars all about?
Right, so the first pillar is all about self-identity.
Self-identity.
It's all about understanding yourself, like your own culture, your background, your beliefs, even your biases. And they really encourage soldiers to explore like every aspect of their identity.
Like, what do you mean?
Things like their ethnicity, nationality, sexuality, gender, religion, economic background, the whole spectrum.
So it's kind of like know thyself before you can even begin to understand and connect with other people, especially people from different backgrounds.
Exactly, and that's crucial in the Army, right?
Right.
You have people from all walks of life coming together to serve.
Oh, for sure.
The book argues that when you understand your own identity, it actually helps you appreciate the differences in others. It makes you more tolerant and respectful, and that can reduce the potential for conflict.
That's fascinating. All right, what about the next pillar?
Okay, pillar number 2 is prevention.
Prevention.
And this is where they tackle the tough stuff head on. They identify different forms of abuse, physical, verbal, emotional, even financial.
Wow.
And they give strategies for how to prevent them.
So no shying away from the difficult conversations.
Absolutely not.
Good.
All right.
Lay the other 2 pillars on me.
All right, number 3 is self-management.
Okay.
This one focuses on how to manage emotions, especially anger and stress.
I feel like we could all use a little help with that.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
But they recognize that unchecked emotions can lead to all sorts of problems, even harmful actions.
For sure.
So they teach practical techniques for recognizing and regulating those feelings.
That's got to be important, not just in the military, but in any relationship.
Oh, absolutely. We all struggle with those emotions at times.
Yeah.
But it's about developing that self-awareness and learning how to cope so those emotions don't control you.
Absolutely. Okay, hit me with the final pillar.
All right, the 4th and final pillar is all about building healthy relationships.
Okay.
And this goes way beyond just avoiding the negative stuff.
Right.
It's about proactively creating positive and supportive connections with the people around you.
I like that.
They emphasize things like communication, empathy, setting boundaries, and learning how to resolve conflict in a constructive way.
So they're giving soldiers a roadmap to like actually creating those healthy connections.
Precisely. And they actually stress the importance of being intentional about your relationships.
What do you mean intentional?
Like actually setting goals for your relationships, communicating your expectations, and making a conscious effort to nurture those connections.
Well, then, wait a minute. Planning your relationships. That sounds a little, I don't know, rigid, doesn't it?
I know, right? But it's not about like scheduling every interaction or micromanaging your friends.
Okay.
It's more about recognizing that healthy relationships, they actually take work. You got to put in the time and effort. They don't just magically happen.
Okay, that makes more sense. So it's not about filling out a calendar for your relationships. It's more about choosing to invest in them and not just hoping for the best.
Exactly. And what's interesting is they apply this to all kinds of relationships, not just romantic ones. They even talk about setting goals for your professional relationships, like improving communication with your boss or building stronger connections with your team.
Wow, my mind is kind of blown right now.
Yeah.
I came into this thinking it'd be all about military stuff,
I know, right?
but this stuff, it's actually really relevant to everyone's life.
It is. The Army recognized that these are universal human challenges.
For sure.
We all face these things in our relationships.
All right, I am officially hooked. But I gotta say, I'm still kind of struggling to picture how this actually plays out in real life.
Right.
Like, does the book give specific examples?
Oh yeah, it's full of them.
Oh, good.
For example, there's this one story about a soldier who was struggling to balance their cultural background with army life. And yeah, so this soldier came from a culture where showing respect for elders was super important, like almost unquestioning.
Right.
But in the army, obviously, rank and authority are more important than age.
Right.
And this soldier was constantly struggling with like having to follow orders from people who were younger than them.
Yeah, I can see how that would be really tough.
It created this huge internal conflict for them.
Tradition versus duty, right?
Exactly.
So how did the relationship literacy stuff help them with that?
Well, remember that first pillar we talked about, self-identity? That's key. The book really stresses the importance of understanding your own background and values.
Right.
And once the soldier realized that their discomfort wasn't about disobedience, but about this clash of values, they could start to find a way to reconcile those two perspectives.
So basically understanding where they were coming from helped them make sense of the situation and figure out how to adapt.
Exactly. It's like recognizing that we all see the world through a certain lens shaped by our upbringing and our culture.
Yeah.
And sometimes those lenses, they don't quite line up with the people around us.
Right.
But once this soldier understood their own cultural lens, they could start to see their fellow soldiers' perspectives more clearly, even if those perspectives were different from their own.
That's awesome. Okay, so you've sold me on the self-identity thing.
Good.
But what about the other pillars?
Yeah.
You give me another example, maybe something a little more relatable for those of us who haven't, dealt with military hierarchies.
Sure, let's talk about teamwork.
Okay.
The book has a ton of examples of how soldiers from totally different backgrounds have to learn to work together effectively.
Right.
And I mean different in every way, right? Ethnicities, religions, socioeconomic statuses, you name it.
Yeah, that sounds familiar.
Yeah. Right. You might have people with totally different communication styles, conflicting values, or even just preconceived notions about each other.
Oh yeah, I've definitely been in those group projects where it feels like everyone is speaking a different language.
Exactly. And it can be a recipe for disaster.
Total disaster.
But the book makes this really interesting point. It says that these differences, which so often lead to conflict, they can actually become a source of strength.
Really?
Yeah. When they're understood and respected, of course. It talks about the importance of things like active listening, finding common ground, and communicating clearly to avoid misunderstandings.
So instead of letting those differences divide the team, you're saying they can actually make the team stronger.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
And this goes beyond just formal teamwork settings.
Right.
Think about any relationship where you run into conflict. Oftentimes it boils down to those same core issues, not understanding the other person's perspective, letting anger or stress take over, or just not having a clear plan for how to communicate effectively.
Wow. This is really resonating with me. It's like you're giving me a whole new way of thinking about conflict.
I'm glad to hear that.
But, okay, let's get even more practical here.
Yeah.
Can you give me an example of how these relationship literacy skills actually help someone handle a specific difficult situation?
Sure. One that comes to mind is about this soldier dealing with a colleague who was just constantly negative and critical.
Oh, yeah, the energy vampire.
Exactly, the type.
Oh, yeah.
And it was starting to affect this soldier's morale and even their ability to focus on their tasks.
Those people can be tough to deal with. So how did this soldier use their training to handle that?
Well, instead of letting the negativity drag them down or getting into a confrontation,
Right.
they actually applied the self-management techniques they'd learned. They took a step back, assessed their own emotions, and then they found a way to communicate their boundaries assertively but respectfully.
So they basically used their emotional regulation skills to de-escalate the situation.
Exactly.
Yeah,
They chose a constructive response instead of reacting impulsively.
that's smart.
And the book emphasizes that these kinds of skills, emotional regulation, conflict resolution, assertive communication,
Yeah.
they're not just for dealing with difficult people.
Right.
They're essential for building any strong relationship.
I'm telling you, I need to sign up for this Army program.
Uh-huh.
Seriously, though, this is eye-opening stuff.
What's really interesting is that this program, it wasn't even originally designed for the military.
Right.
The Army adapted it from a model that's been used successfully in all sorts of settings, which just goes to show you that these principles, they really are universal.
That's pretty cool. Okay, so you've officially converted me. Relationship literacy is something we should all be paying attention to.
Got to hear it.
But before we wrap up, there's one thing that's still kind of bugging me. It's like we keep saying how practical this book is, but we've been talking pretty broadly.
Right.
What about like actual advice?
Yeah.
Real world tips that people can use?
Well, that's the great thing about this book. It doesn't just talk about concepts, it actually gives you strategies. For example, in the self-management section, there's a whole part on dealing with anger.
Okay.
It talks about things like how to identify your triggers, how to recognize the physical signs that you're getting angry, and then developing coping mechanisms like deep breathing or taking a time out.
That's really helpful. I feel like we've all been there,
Oh, yeah.
where we let anger get the best of us.
Yeah.
Having those techniques to de-escalate could be a real game changer.
For sure. And it's not just anger management either. There's advice on communication skills, conflict resolution, even setting healthy boundaries in relationships.
Nice.
It's packed with practical advice.
So they really thought of everything. It's funny how we started this deep dive talking about an Army relationship guide.
I know, right?
And now it's like we've got this whole toolkit for building stronger connections in every part of life.
That's the point, though. These principles, they're universal.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if you're a soldier or a student, a parent, a CEO. The ability to build healthy relationships is fundamental.
Okay, I'm sold. Everyone needs to check out this book.
I agree.
We'll definitely link to it in the show notes. But before we sign off, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about.
Okay.
We've talked a lot about building healthy connections, but what about the opposite?
Right.
How do we recognize and address those unhealthy relationships that are already in our lives?
That's a great question.
I think that's equally important.
Absolutely. Recognizing those unhealthy patterns and knowing when to get help or make a change, that's crucial.
It's huge. Maybe that'll be our next deep dive.
Maybe so.
But until then, my fellow deep divers, keep those connections strong, and remember, healthy relationships are an investment worth making. We'll catch you on the next episode of The Deep Dive, where we'll be exploring the fascinating world of ancient Mesopotamian culinary practices.
Oh, wow.
Get ready to tantalize those taste buds.
Get ready to tantalize those taste buds.